Do you remember when I said at the beginning of this series that to understand Metroid you had to forget about the typical classic Nintendo design approach? Because Metroid is so different from the standard, being not childish, not funny, and gameplay-wise more complicated instead of just fun? Well, for the purposes of this video, I'm going to need you to forget about forgetting that. There's an exception to every rule, and in the case of the Metroid series, that exception is comics, which have been part of the franchise since before the release of Metroid 2. Or in other words, since before most people even realized the protagonist is a woman. Metroid games are dark and serious, often with a heavy undertone of existential dread. Metroid comics, on the other hand, are upbeat, sometimes goofy, and generally treat Samus's experiences like an adventure, more in line with what you'd expect from, say, Mario, or Link, or Kirby even. Metroid's debut in the Tooniverse can be found in a very rare Japanese tankobon or bound volume from 1989 called The Shape of Happiness, an anthology of video game spin-off stories mostly based on Konami properties like Twinbee, Gradius, and Castlevania. That's right, Metroid was being lumped in with Castlevania long before the release of Symphony of the Night. I can't really explain it, because back in the 80s the two franchises were very different. Castlevania had more in common with Ninja Gaiden and Ghosts and Goblins than it did with Metroid, but I think there may have been some awareness that they appealed to a similar kind of customer. In any case, this first Metroid comic's art and character design seem heavily indebted to the work of Akira Toriyama, especially Dragon Ball, and its story is fittingly a loose and silly adaptation of Metroid, in the same way that Dragon Ball was a loose and silly interpretation of Journey to the West. Samus is still a tough and stoic bounty hunter in this story, trusted by the Federation despite her mysterious origins. They don't know Samus's age, gender, or even species, because she never removes her armor suit. On the other hand, she also has a pet in this version, a little alien armadillo creature named Mari Yoshimura. Get it? Mario? After being offered a direct deposit to her secret Swiss bank account, and a couple of rare Famicom Disk System games, Samus agrees to infiltrate the space pirate facility on Zebes and destroy Mother Brain. As she's resting up for the trip at a hotel, Samus is almost assassinated by one of Mother Brain's agents masquerading as a bellhop, who also stabs her pet in a murderous frenzy. Samus vows revenge and jets off to Zebes. Once on the planet, Samus pulls out a strategy guide to help her find all the power-ups, but unfortunately it turns out to be for a different game. Luckily though, Zebes in this story isn't so much a high-tech fortress as it is an old-timey factory staffed by a bunch of clock punchers who hate their jobs. She finds several energy tanks in the employee cafeteria, then defeats an elevator operator who turns out to be Kraid. Fake Kraid, that is, just like in the NES game. Samus overcomes this minor setback by slapping a sticky note on the body declaring it to be the real Kraid. She then defeats Ridley, not with missiles or bombs, but by getting lost looking for upgrades and wasting so much time that Ridley dies of old age waiting for her to show up. Making her way into Turian, Samus is chomped on by a Metroid, but she turns the situation to her advantage by freezing it and then wearing its frozen body like a hat to disguise herself and sneak past all the other Metroids. The story then ends on a cliffhanger, as Mother Brain is replaced by the head of a famous strategy guide writer, who tells the reader that Metroid's true ending is a secret, and they'll have to finish the game to see it. If you've played the original Metroid, this comic is an absolute riot. It's the best kind of parody, one made by people with in-depth knowledge of what the original is like, but also a willingness to be silly and out there, instead of just picking on flaws in the original. It would be a stretch to say that a story in which Samus has a secret Swiss bank account and a pet armadillo is an authentic adaptation of Metroid. But in a way, it's authentic to the experience of playing Metroid. It has the spirit of Metroid running through it, and that spirit is what makes it funny. The next time Samus showed up in print was the opposite, authentic to the series visually and thematically, but lacking in that spirit derived from the games themselves. And that has entirely to do with the nature of the comic, Captain N, published in 1990 in the United States. Captain N was originally a really bizarre Saturday morning cartoon that was sort of like He-Man, but with the Temu versions of classic Nintendo characters. A gamer geek gets teleported through his television screen and ends up in Videoland, where it turns out he's the chosen one, foretold by an ancient prophecy to do something or other. Like most late 80s cartoons, the plot goes all over the place and rarely makes a whole lot of sense. But one of the few consistent plot threads is that the main villain that Captain N and his buddies are always thwarting is Mother Brain, who lives in a floating techno-fortress called Metroid. Not appearing in Captain N are actual Metroids, Kraid, Ridley, any of Samus's powers, or Samus herself. This is because in the 1980s, video game-based shows were not made to reflect the unique qualities of individual game franchises. They were made to rehash the same wacky adventure format that Hanna-Barbera and DiC and their ilk had been selling for eons at this point, making it fresh by shoving in contemporary references wherever they would fit. Almost any script from a video game show in the 80s could be turned into a script for any other video game show by just swapping names out and inserting the proper catchphrases. These shows had no continuity and no dramatic development. They were pure popcorn, and to be fair, that's what most kids wanted on Saturday morning anyway. But it means that in a crossover show like Captain N, characters were chosen from various game franchises on the basis of how well they fit a pre-existing mold. Simon Belmont made the cut because the writers needed a big dumb guy. Princess Lana, a completely made-up character, had to be there to give Captain N a love interest. Mega Man and Kid Icarus are on the show because... Actually, I have no idea why they're on the show, because they're both mega Dorcases, but because their dialogue largely revolves around reacting to things with speech impediments, they must have been easy to write for. The point is, Mother Brain fit into this format quite well, as a scheming main villain who has to rely on incompetent henchmen, because, well, she's a brain in a jar. Samus, and really everything else unique to Metroid, didn't work with the formula, so the writers never bothered with them. The lead writer for Captain N's first season has admitted that he never even heard of Samus Aran while working on the show. She simply wasn't relevant to what the producers wanted, and it's not like these people actually played video games. Now, this is all concerning the TV show specifically. The comics were another thing, and because they had a slightly older target market, their stories were allowed to be a bit more mature. Also, licensing considerations deprived the comics of several characters central to the show. Simon Belmont and Mega Man weren't owned by Nintendo, so the comic writers found themselves having to replace them with more first-party characters, which eventually included Samus Aran. Samus certainly looks the part when she shows up in the Captain N comics. She's a tall, tough bounty hunter with a mane of blonde hair who's always shooting her arm cannon or being shot at. But her personality is slightly off. Here Samus is a mercenary type, like the typical bounty hunter described in Metroid's manual. She's not quite on the level of Boba Fett, but Han Solo wouldn't be far off. She even has an encounter with a bug-like bounty hunter that echoes Han's famous shootout with Greedo in A New Hope. The second time she appears, Samus reveals a second unexpected facet of her character: romantic interest. She develops a crush on Captain N practically as soon as they meet, and after he saves her life later on, she begins openly flirting with him and suggesting that they explore the galaxy together. Near the end of this story, she sells the rest of the team out to Mother Brain for cash, only insisting that Captain N be released, for obvious reasons. But it turns out this is part of an elaborate plot to rescue the gang by impersonating the guards and breaking everyone out of prison. Again, like Han and Luke in A New Hope. But even more than Han Solo, this Samus reminds me of another video game character who hadn't been created yet: Lara Croft from the original Tomb Raider. It's easy to forget this after so many attempts at rebooting the series, but the original Lara was adventurous to a fault. An important part of her backstory was being disowned by her aristocrat father for dealing with so many criminal types and stealing so much treasure. She's a scamp, competent but irresponsible, and it's that irresponsibility that makes her interesting. Likewise, the Captain N version of Samus is an interesting character. Unlike most video game protagonists, she does have a real personality, if a cliché one. She goes through a whole arc and everything, but she's also not really Samus. If there's one thing I've learned from my recent foray into Metroid comics, it's that any given Metroid adaptation outside the world of video games can get at most 2 out of the following 3 things right about Samus. 1. Backstory. 2. Personality. And 3. Hair color. Thankfully, by 1994, someone finally decided to make one which only got the hair wrong. That someone was Benimaru Itoh, often referred to as Ashura or Ash, who worked for companies closely associated with Nintendo over a period of several decades, usually as an art director or character designer. The first video game he's credited on is Earthbound, probably due to his close friendship with Shigesato Itoi, another guy who was mostly famous for things he did before getting into video games. Like most employees of Itoi's Ape Inc., he went on to help form Creatures Inc., the company responsible for designing new Pokémon. Itoh oversaw most of the 3D models for spin-off games, like Pokémon Stadium in the late 90s. From there, he moved on to HAL Laboratory, where he contributed design ideas for a bunch of handheld Kirby games. Itoh was also the lead artist for Picross 3D, which explains that game's unorthodox mascot character and offbeat but charming animations. I think it's worth noting that Picross 3D Round 2, which didn't involve Itoh, entirely lacked animations for its finished puzzles, which really felt wrong in a way that's hard to describe. But in 1994, none of that had happened yet. Itoh was known at this point not as a video game artist, but just as an artist who drew tie-in comics based on a few specific Nintendo game series, usually having something to do with science fiction. These comics were translated into English and published in Nintendo Power magazine as part of Nintendo's marketing push for new franchise launches. And I don't know how effective they were as promotional tools, but as slices of contemporary pop culture, they're wonderful. Itoh's style was more Western-inspired than what you'd see in most Nintendo-produced manga from this period, but it would have been distinctive anywhere. He favored bold color combinations and thick outlines, with lots of textural hatching and a stronger grasp of perspective than you'd expect from anything video game-related. Itoh's true masterpiece, in my opinion, is his Star Fox comic from 1993, which not only has beautiful artwork, but also makes the Star Fox crew look cooler and feel more like real people than all the actual Star Fox games put together. It also anticipated quite a few plot ideas that the series would pick up on years later, like giving Fox a feisty vixen as a love interest, or the fake-out boss fight against Andross, which conceals his true intentions and identity. Itoh wasn't just a great artist, he was also a great writer, and he showed off both of those talents a year later when he wrote a comic loosely adapting the events of Super Metroid, which would also feature many forward-looking story concepts. This 60-page comic is way more complicated than either of the previous two, so I won't outline the whole story. I'm going to combine my usual story recap and legacy segments here, and just go over Itoh's important contributions to Metroid lore as they come up. The manga begins, like Super Metroid itself, with Samus recounting the story of the first two Metroid games, as if to herself, before receiving the distress call from Ceres that kicks off the action. One big change, which the series would officially embrace later, is that she doesn't simply say that the Metroid followed her like a child. Here Samus explicitly states that the Metroid imprinted on her and thought of her as its mother. More on that later. When Samus breaks in on Ridley and the Metroid infant, we now find that instead of silently menacing her with his glowing eyes, Ridley can now actually talk, and he is one smarmy son of a gun. It's sort of implied that Ridley could talk in Super Metroid. How else would he command his underlings? But he and Samus didn't really have a reason to talk to each other instead of just blasting away. But with Mother Brain being less of an active presence, again, brain in a jar, the manga needs a talky antagonist, and Ridley fills that role. As Samus hurries away from Ceres, she runs into a fellow bounty hunter, Armstrong Houston. And yes, that spectacularly red meat all-American name is what he was called in Japanese too. Houston is the first fellow bounty hunter in Metroid lore to ally himself with Samus. Technically, there was a side-hopper bounty hunter from Captain N called Big Time Brannigan. Don't ask. But he was working for Mother Brain. Also, he was even more of a non-entity than Greedo in Star Wars, who he's clearly modeled on and who dies exactly the same way. Houston is not a very helpful companion to Samus at first. In fact, he's just as greedy as the Captain N version of Samus, and he seems quite capable of ditching her to run back to the Federation and collect the bounty for defeating the pirates. But there is a strain of hero worship in him, and over time he develops a genuine interest in working with Samus, if only because she's cool and he wants her to team up with him. He even saves her life at one point, a tradition that would be proudly carried on by Rundus, Adam Malkovich, and Anthony, remember me, Higgs. When Samus and Houston return to Galactic Federation HQ, they run into two more new characters. Federation Chairman Keaton, an officious green alien who will never not remind me of Kif from Futurama, and Police Chief Hardy, a bumbling and cowardly space cop who's something like a futuristic Sheriff of Nottingham. Not the cool one from Prince of Thieves, the dumb fat one from the Errol Flynn movie. Hardy was supposed to patrol Zebes to make sure the pirates were really defeated, but he dropped the ball big time and Keaton chews him out for it. Samus gives both of them short shrift and rushes off to confront the pirates on Zebes, rebuffing Houston at the same time, because she thinks, correctly, that all he wants is the reward money. Later, though, Houston catches up with her in the middle of a pirate ambush and throws her an energy refill just in the nick of time. Samus still wants him to leave afterward, but he's interested in picking up pirate claws for the bounty and insists on accompanying her. Which proves to be a very good thing, because a short while later, Samus gets momentarily distracted, causing her suit to power down just as a spike trap activates. With her defenses lowered, Samus has no protection against the spike, which skewers her left arm and immobilizes her. Houston is able to set her free, but she's still badly injured with a broken power suit. The situation is serious enough that Houston chooses to abandon his trophies to carry Samus back to her ship, where the coordinates are set for a distant planet. It's here that Samus is reunited with a friend from her childhood, Old Bird, one of the few Chozo left alive after the disasters on SR-388 and Zebes. He immediately realizes what's gone wrong with the power suit, and as he prepares a treatment, he tells Houston the story of Samus's upbringing among the Chozo. When Samus was born, her family lived in a space colony called K2L, located near the Chozo homeworld of Zebes, probably because the Chozo were a peaceful people and the humans trusted them. But this also made them a target, and when the vicious space pirates attacked Zebes, they also decided to sack K2L and massacre its inhabitants. When the few survivors among the Chozo made their way back to the colony, among all the devastation they found only one human survivor, Samus, who was still a small child and had lost both of her parents in the raid. Taking pity on Samus, the Chozo adopted her and raised her as one of their own. Although peaceful, the Chozo were naturally stronger than humans, and to protect Samus as she grew up, they gave her two gifts: a blood transfusion that provided her with their natural abilities, and a custom-made power suit that would make her body as tough as theirs. Both of these gifts are inseparable from Samus herself. They're part of her, and no one else can effectively use them. but the marvelous powers of the suit come with a cost. Its energy is connected with Samus's mind. If she's distracted or loses her will to fight, the suit stops working and leaves her vulnerable to attack. Old Bird surmises that this is why the spike trap was able to injure her. She must have been distracted by thoughts of someone she cared about, most likely the infant Metroid held captive by the pirates. So far, the influence of this manga on the overall series has been pretty nebulous. We've seen new bounty hunters, a suggestion of how the Federation operates, and characters speaking who were silent before. But what happens in Chapter 4 is its most important legacy. This is not a story of Samus's childhood. It's the story of her childhood, one which no future game in the series has dared to contradict. It's just that good, and contains so many details that later games would take advantage of. Over the course of 7 pages, the Super Metroid manga tells us about the civilization of the Chozo, which has been teased at since those bird statues first appeared in the original Metroid. It tells us about Samus's human parents, her unique reason for hating the pirates more than anyone else, which would later be focused specifically on Ridley, and why her suit has special powers. And most importantly, it explains why Samus acts as a kind of bridge between human and alien races, the same reason why she feels more strongly about the infant Metroid than anyone else does. As the adopted child of an alien race, Samus doesn't see the galaxy in us versus them terms. She's willing to look for the humanity in things that don't appear human, because the Chozo represent her idea of family, and they're not human. This character element is absolutely crucial to the stories of Metroid Fusion, Metroid Prime 2, and Metroid Other M. It's also strongly connected with her Chozo heritage, which is essential to the backstory of Metroid Prime, and also a major aspect of Zero Mission and Samus Returns. Plus, it almost goes without saying that the most recent 2D Metroid game, Metroid Dread, leans very heavily on both the humanity found in strange places trope and the importance of the Chozo to Samus's worldview. In a series that often fails to carry plot threads through to a satisfying conclusion, this is the one thing that Nintendo seems never to have forgotten about. Anyway, while Samus recuperates under the care of Old Bird, trouble is afoot back in Federation territory. Chairman Keaton and Hardy, having been informed of Samus's sudden departure from Zebes, become impatient and decide to attack the pirates themselves. But their rash decision soon unravels as both of them are captured by Ridley and taken deep into the bowels of Zebes to serve as bait for Samus. Down in Turian, Mother Brain is furious at the infant Metroid's refusal to obey it as the other cloned Metroids do. Ridley calms her down by suggesting a solution. If Samus is killed right in front of the Metroid, the shock will snap it out of its imprinting, and it will be susceptible to Mother Brain's telepathic manipulation. To lure Samus in faster, the pirates amplify Keaton and Hardy's cries of terror, so that Samus will pick them up even across the vast depths of space. When Samus hears their distress signal, she's determined to return to Zebes and save the chairman. In order to heal her suit more quickly, she taps into the explosive energy of her power bombs, a risky maneuver analogous to using the Crystal Flash in Super Metroid. Despite Old Bird's misgivings, the technique is successful, and Samus springs up fully powered, ready to face the pirates once again. As Samus lays waste to the pirates on Zebes, Keaton and Hardy manage to escape from their bubble by distracting a guard with some food that Hardy sneaked in. Because of course he did. Ridley sees how powerful Samus has become, and shrewdly decides to split before she gets to Turian, leaving his troops to be obliterated in his place. And this is where things get a little weird. So as Samus is fighting the Mother Brain, Keaton and Hardy are bumbling around with some stolen pirate guns, and as the infant Metroid flies through a doorway, Hardy zaps it and kills it instantly. No pathos, no sacrifice to pay off all that buildup from earlier, it just collapses and dies before Samus even finds it. A few pages later, she runs across its body and is devastated, vowing to take revenge on Mother Brain, whom she wrongly assumes was responsible. Then, just like in the game, Samus blows Mother Brain to bits and sets off the base's self-destruct function. Samus, Keaton, Hardy, and Houston all manage to escape with just a few panels left to go, which is just enough time for Houston to commiserate with Samus over the Metroid's death and make one last-ditch offer to team up, which Samus coolly rejects. So yeah, kind of a limp and anticlimactic ending for such a well-written setup. I don't know if there was a mandate that every chapter had to have at least one comic relief moment, but turning the infant Metroid's death into one was a really boneheaded decision. I think it's actually possible that Itoh wasn't made aware of Super Metroid's ending before writing the manga, or that Nintendo asked him to alter it so that fans wouldn't have the ending spoiled for them. Because ending the manga with writing this clunky would make no sense if he had access to the brilliant ending which the game uses. However, disappointing ending aside, the Super Metroid manga is overall a very fun read, which adds a lot of depth to the series' canon. This was the first time that Samus was treated not as a vehicle for player expression, a joke character who exists to spout punchlines, or an extra in someone else's story who exists just to be a love interest, and a foil to the main love interest at that. Instead, Itoh presented Samus as a protagonist in her own right, a person with strengths and weaknesses, with emotions and tough decisions to make. 1994 marks a turning point in the history of the Metroid series, partly motivated by this very manga, which saw it turn away from merely hinting its story, like the first 3 games did, and go more in the direction of actually telling a story, with dialogue and dramatic on-screen action, and all the other tools that writers use. Going forward, Metroid would be a lot less subtle, and arguably less intelligent, but its appeal would also become more immediate and engaging. Metroid Fusion would be the ultimate expression of this more linear, story-focused approach to 2D Metroid, with Other M regrettably representing the 3D equivalent. The Prime trilogy, whose stories are probably the most appreciated among post-2000 Metroid games, might seem at first to have escaped its influence, but that's an illusion. The stories of the Prime games, despite being largely optional and in the background, are heavily indebted not just to the structure of Super Metroid, but also the narrative style of its tie-in manga, particularly when they attempt to characterize Samus herself. But I think it's also fair to say that the series lost something with this manga. There would be other Metroid comics in the future, most notably the 2-volume retelling of Samus's early years, which began publication in 2003 and would serve as a major inspiration for Other M. But starting here, they would all be just as serious and grounded as the games. Never again would we see a goofy parody like the first Metroid manga, and that's kind of sad when you consider how ripe some of the later entries in the series were for satire. Imagine a Mad Magazine version of Other M. Now that's what I call entertainment. It's been a general truism of Nintendo game franchises that the longer they go on, the more ossified and inflexible their brand identities become. Back before the mid-2000s, Mario games could take on a wide range of potential ideas, even going as far as horror at times. Now his series has mostly been crammed into the straitjacket of family fun. Zelda games could once surprise you with whipsawing changes in their tone and atmosphere. Now they've settled down to being sandbox explorathons all about freedom and player expression. And Metroid, which used to be able to let its hair down and be goofy and fun like the other Nintendo franchises, is now expected to be the mature, responsible one that never cracks a smile no matter what. You know what I like about the ending screens in Zero Mission? It's that they imply Samus has a life outside of bounty hunting, that every now and then, when she's not blasting alien bugs or diving into lakes of lava, she gets to live it up a little and have fun. The Super Metroid manga didn't show us this side of Samus, but by fleshing out her character, it did provide a reason to think she had another side to her. That's a promise that the series hasn't followed up on since 1994, and I think it's high time somebody tried. We've had Metroid games about Metroids, Metroid games about shape-shifting parasites, Metroid games about sentient blue goop, and even Metroid games about evil Aztec warrior Chozo. Maybe, if the series goes on long enough, we'll finally get a Metroid game about Samus. No, not Other M, I mean a good game about Samus. Preferably one in which Samus is not a shrimp with parental abandonment issues, Ridley is not a goddamn Furby, and Anthony Higgs stays exactly the same, because he is perfect. Okay, thanks Nintendo, bye!